it appears in international law as forcible displacement. So the ethnic element is missing there.
Piers Morgan hosts a blistering segment with Avraham Burg, former speaker and ex-IDF soldier, as they dive headfirst into whether Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. Burg doesn't hold back, torching not only Israeli leadership, but also calling out America, Germany, the UK, and the EU for complicity. This is a high-voltage takedown of Israel's policies, the global diplomatic cover shielding them, and the growing authoritarianism inside the Israeli state. If you thought this was just another political segment, buckle up, because what Burg lays out here could shake the entire foundation of Western foreign policy. And spoiler alert, Burg is absolutely mopping the floor here.
But the difference is that in ethnic cleansing, what you're trying to do is to remove a particular ethnic group from an area that your own ethnic group would like to have. And where they go and what they do once they leave is their business. You don't care about it. In genocide, what you're trying to do is to destroy that group as a group, wherever it is. Now, in this case, and in many, many other cases of genocide in history, they began as ethnic cleansing. And you can go as far back as 1904, the German genocide of the Herero. You can talk about the Armenian genocide by the Ottoman Empire in World War I. And indeed, the Holocaust itself began as an attempt by the Nazi regime to be rid of Jews, just to expel them, to force them to emigrate someplace. But when people don't move because they don't want to leave their homes or because they have no place to go and no one will take them in, then what do you do with them if you've already made the decision that they have to leave? Then you start using more and more force, and that's when ethnic cleansing becomes genocide.
This is textbook escalation, and Burke lays it out in brutal clarity. Ethnic cleansing isn't a destination, it's the on-ramp to genocide. What begins as get out of here turns into we'll kill you until you leave or disappear entirely. And anyone still playing dumb about what's happening in Gaza, wake up.
And in this case, I do think that the far right in Israel has spoken openly about it. What they want is to ethnically cleanse not only Gaza, but also the West Bank. And there is a creeping ethnic cleansing of the West Bank, and techniques from Gaza being imported, from IDF operations in Gaza being imported now to the West Bank. But the people there don't want to move. They want to stay in their homes. And so you use more and more force, more and more violence to persuade them, or as Israeli politicians say, to encourage them to leave, which means forcing them by killing them.
Who is accountable if Israel is waging a genocide here? And we may not know the full detail of any genocide until international media are allowed in, because at the moment they're banned. So it's very hard to verify a lot of the stuff that's going on, which I think is disgraceful. But ultimately, who is accountable? You know, Israel kind of ignores what the International Criminal Court says. It ignores and degrades and mocks the United Nations. It really only seems to really listen to the United States in terms of other countries. So ultimately, who would hold Israel to account if it was perpetrating a genocide?
So first of all, some people are accountable, even if the ICJ eventually does not rule that it was a genocide. There are, for instance, arrest warrants against Netanyahu and his former defense minister Gallant for war crimes and crimes against humanity, including using starvation as a tool of war. So people should be held accountable, even if it is not eventually adjudicated as genocide. But who is accountable? Well, first of all, of course, it's the State of Israel. It's its leaders and military leaders. And often soldiers are also, because people are carrying out unlawful laws, unlawful orders, which in Israel actually is not allowed by Israeli law. You are not allowed to accept to operate under unlawful laws. But as you say, Israel is allowed to do that. The impunity that Israel has comes, first of all, from the United States. The United States is the main supplier of Israel with arms, with economic aid, and most importantly, perhaps, with a diplomatic Iron Dome. That is, that if the Security Council were to try and impose some sanctions on Israel, the United States would veto it, as it is done historically. But also European countries, I have to say, are complicit in this. Germany, the UK, France, countries that are suppliers of Israel with arms. Germany supplies about 20 to 30% of the arms to Israel, and again supply it with diplomatic cover. And the EU is a much more important economic partner with Israel than is the United States. And so as long as there is no pressure on Israel, and Israeli leaders are aware of that, they can do whatever they like. Nobody is brought to account, and that is a catastrophe, first of all, for Palestinians, of course, also for the State of Israel, which is now becoming increasingly authoritarian and will end up being a full-blown apartheid state that won't be able to exist as such very long. But finally, also for the entire regime of international law, that you have a state that has just thrown it to the garbage. It's just not there anymore. And other rogue states will draw their own conclusions, and the entire order of international law that was put into place after World War II, after the Holocaust, after the crime of the Nazis, is now being destroyed by the state that saw itself as the answer to the Holocaust. That's a terrible tragedy.
What the Israeli government people I've had on would say, because they do say it, is Israel had no choice. That on October the 7th, they were attacked in such a spectacular terrorist attack with so many killed, so many wounded, so many kidnapped, and with the Hamas leadership openly saying we want to keep doing this through their PR spokesman on camera. We want to keep doing more and more of this. That it was an existential threat to Israelis, that they had not just a right to defend themselves, but a duty, and that because Hamas had created this huge tunnel system, which protected the terrorists but not the civilian population, and because they then embedded themselves in places like schools, hospitals, mosques, so on, deliberately, in the Israeli government's eyes, that there was no other way to remove the threat of Hamas than to do it the way they've been doing it. In other words, we could only get rid of the terrorists, as they see it, from Hamas by attacking them where they are hiding, which is in the main in civilian populations. What would your response be to that justification?
So let me just quote you one figure first that struck me recently, that since the reestablishment of these points of food distribution in late May, these 4 points of distribution, of which right now only 2 are open for 2 million people, well over 800 civilians seeking food have been shot. And it appears that they were all shot, or mostly shot, by Israeli troops as crowd control. By artillery, tank fire, and gunfire. That just gives you an idea of what is happening there. This is the same number as the number of Israeli civilians that were killed on October 7th by Hamas militants. Now, as for the question itself, yes, of course, Israel had no choice but to respond, and part of the response had to be military. But we know, first of all, that there is no way of resolving this issue simply through bombs. And we have seen it again and again and again. You cannot simply bomb the problem of 7 million Jews ruling over 7 million Palestinians through bombs. It will come back again and again. Specifically for the operation, if we conclude that the only way to achieve what Netanyahu calls absolute victory in Gaza, if the only way is to entirely destroy Gaza, kill tens of thousands of civilians, including close to 20,000 children, that is, if your response to what could be described as a genocidal attack by Hamas is to perpetrate genocide, then you have lost all moral standing on that.
Moral clarity doesn't get more savage than this. Burg admits Hamas' attack was horrific, but he doesn't let Israel off the hook. He slaps down the "we had no choice" excuse like a housewife. You don't fight genocide with genocide, unless your goal is revenge, not justice. Also, can we talk about the 800 plus starving civilians shot at food lines? That's not war, that's slow motion execution.
You cannot answer genocide with genocide and remain a member of the international community.
What do you say to people, John Spencer's one of them, who will argue that if you look at the numbers in terms of combatants, terrorists, militants, however people describe them, I call them terrorists, who've been killed in relation to civilians, that actually the war in Gaza bears reasonable comparison to other urban wars of the last 100 years, outside of World War II, obviously, and that Israel has actually gone out of its way to warn civilians to remove themselves from areas they want to target, that it has fed Gazans, albeit many people view it's been criminally depriving Gazans of food, but they would argue which other army has fed their enemy, and so on, and that they are ultimately behaving in a very moral, ethical way. I mean, we've heard this argument repeatedly. What do you say to that?
Yeah, we've heard that the IDF is the most moral army in the world. Even when I served in the IDF in the 1970s, it was not the most moral army in the world. As somebody was said, more moral than the Danish army. I mean, how moral is it? But now it's a totally different organization from the one that I was in the war of 1973. Look, the statistics that are being cited are simply false. The number of civilians, the ratio of civilians to militants depends on how many militants have been killed. And curiously, even the IDF is citing the numbers being given by the health authorities, the so-called Hamas-controlled health authorities in Gaza. So the figures are false. The statistics are that between 2 and 5% of the population have been killed. 60 to 70% of them civilians. A third of those killed are children. Over 1,000 of those killed are children below the age of 1. That's a ratio that has not existed in the 21st century. And indeed, you have to go back to World War II for these figures. Some of the destruction in cities in Gaza is greater than the destruction of Hiroshima in nuclear weapons.
More devastation than Hiroshima from conventional weapons? At this point, you have to laugh to keep from screaming. Burg casually drops this nuke of a stat, and somehow the world still acts like this is just complicated geopolitics.
And so we now have only one part of Gaza that is not completely flattened, and right now, as we speak, in Deir al-Balah, the IDF is involved in destroying it. And as one reserve Israeli officer said just a couple of days ago, what the IDF is involved in now is actually not fighting, and there hasn't been a war there since June of 2024. It's involved in destroying the place, flattening it, or protecting contractors that are being brought from Israel, paid very well for it, to destroy one building after another. So that over 70% of the structures in Gaza are no longer standing. 90% of the schools have been destroyed or damaged. So this is a rate of destruction that is unprecedented. In Syria, in the civil war in Syria, in 13 years, 2% of the population were killed. And Israel has accomplished that already, apparently, by the summer of 2024. So the rate is huge. And the intent is quite clear, and you can see it from all the reports coming in from Gaza.
The Israelis say again that this is the biggest attack on Jewish people since the Holocaust in World War II, and that in World War II, the Allies killed many more civilians than have been killed in Gaza, and nobody seemed as exercised about that as they are now about what Israel's been doing in Gaza. You know, again, you will have heard that argument many times, but why do you think that is an unreasonable comparison to be made?
Well, there are two things to be said about that. First of all, this term that was used immediately after October 7th and has been recycled over and over, that this is the biggest killing of Jews since the Holocaust. It may be true, it may not, that's not, but it's used for a particular purpose. It's used to evoke the Holocaust, both in the Israeli public and in the international community, not least among Jewish populations in other countries. That is that Israel is threatened again with another Auschwitz, and therefore it has to do everything that it takes to thwart that threat. And in doing so, it cannot abide by any international rules or regulations. It doesn't have to listen to anyone. The Gentiles stood by when the Jews were killed in the Holocaust, and therefore we can do whatever we believe we need to do. So that's the first sort of what this term evokes. As for the killing of civilians, yes, of course, the U.S. Air Force, the RAF, bombed and killed, intentionally, bombed civilian areas, open cities, and killed an estimated 600,000 German civilians. And that could have been, had they been put on trial, could have been described as a war crime. There were others who said it was a legitimate military target, and that could be debated one way or the other. But when they came to Germany after the war, they did not intend to carry out genocide of Germany. The Americans produced the Marshall Plan, which produced a German economic miracle. And I remember living in Britain many years ago, and Brits were saying, you know, we won the war, but the Germans are doing economically so much better than us. So there was no intent, there was no genocidal intent at the time. And in fact, political leaders in Britain, in the United States, kept saying we are fighting the war not against the German people, but against the Nazi regime. Had Israel said that, had Israel said, we want to destroy Hamas, we are calling upon the Palestinians in Gaza to come together with us, we'll defeat Hamas, and then we will help you build your own entity, your own independent entity. We will help you do that as long as we destroy Hamas, then we would have been looking at a completely different scenario. But that's not the intent of the Israeli government. The intent is to take over. You know, today, the Knesset voted on annexing the West Bank. This is the first vote, of course. It's not a law yet. But the goal is annexation and having the land and having as few of its indigenous population remain there once it's annexed.
Yeah. It's extraordinary. Omer Bartov, thank you very much indeed. I really appreciate you coming on the show.